Hello everybody, welcome to my literature saga. Today let us discuss the poem When I Consider How My Light Is Spent. So John Milton was an English poet who wrote during the 17th century, whose works have greatly influenced the literary world. And regarding the age in which he lived and wrote, we can call it a very complex or very critical period in the history of England. So if you want to know more about the age in which he lived and wrote, you can watch the video that I have made on the age of Milton. And the link of the same is available in the description box below. So if you want to know more about the age in which he lived and wrote, you can watch the same. So I'm not going to give you a brief biographical sketch of the poet, but we can go through the major works that he have written and also more about the characteristics of his poetry, because I feel that it is much more relevant as well as much more important than giving a brief biographical sketch. So we know he is very famous for his epic, the magnum opus, Paradise Lost. He is in every line of that particular book, Paradise Lost. And this comment was made by the romantic poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He said so. John Milton is in every line of Paradise Lost. And there is no doubt that on every line that he has written, there is a stamp of his personality. And obviously, Milton, the poet, is an essential corollary of Milton, the man. And the same is what you can find in this poem too, on his blindness. So before moving on to the chief characteristics of his poetry, let us have a look at the major works or his major contributions. So from his birth to the conclusion of his education, that is from 1608 to 1638, we can call this period as early verse period, his early verse period. And there is another period that follows, that is his period of life where he wrote much of his prose writings. And that is indeed his political period, ranging from 1638 to 1660. That is precisely the year of Restoration. And during that era, he served as an official under the protectorate government of Oliver Cromwell, and he used his talent to promote the government and the ways of government. So just as he says in his Paradise Lost, in his introduction to the Paradise Lost, the aim of his poetry being the one that is to justify God's ways to man. Here we can see that in this political period, that is while he served under the protectorate of Oliver Cromwell, he used his writings mainly for justifying the ways of the government to the people. And after that, from 1660 to 1674, we can see that he began to write the major works of his poetic life. The major poems belonging to the first period, that is the early verse period, are On the Morning of Christ's Nativity, which was published in the year 1629, two English sonnets, O Nightingale and How Soon Hath Time, and there are also some Italian sonnets too. Then there comes the L'Allegro and Il Penseroso, Comus, Lycidas. Lycidas was written in the year 1637. So that is all about his first period, that is the period of early verses. Then coming to the second period, we have a few pamphlets like Church Discipline, then the pamphlets dealing with divorce, that is Doctrine and Discipline of Divorce, the Judgment of Martin Bucer, Tetrachordon, and Colasterian. Then his famous work Areopagitica of Education, which was written in the year 1644 also, belongs to the second period. The Tenure of Kings and Magistrates, and few pamphlets like The Ready and Easy Way to Establish a Free Commonwealth, and 16 English sonnets. And we can see that his major works appear in the third period of his poetic career, beginning with The Paradise Lost, which was written in the year 1667, followed by Paradise Regained in 1671, and Samson Agonistes in 1671. So that is all about the major works of John Milton. Then regarding the characteristic of his poetry, we know his style is something that can be called as a grand style. And regarding the diction, he wrote in melodious lines and cadences, that is without a conscious effort. And according to the Romantic poet Coleridge, Milton is not picturesque, but a musical poet, says he. And Tennyson calls him the God-gifted voice of England. And there is always a sense of beauty in all his verses. At the same time, we can also see the high seriousness with which he has written most of his works. We know what Matthew Arnold said in his work, The Study of Poetry. High seriousness is the test of all great poetry. And that high seriousness, it is there in John Milton's works. But T.S. Eliot, in his Metaphysical Poets, criticizes John Milton on exerting an impact that is not overall productive over the writers who came after him. This grand style, this refined language, this lofty thought left the poems more crude, where the feeling too became crude. That was the allegation against Milton raised by T.S. Eliot in his work Metaphysical Poets. And regarding the element of imagination, we can see that his sustained power of imagination finds its best representation in his major works, mainly in his Paradise Lost. And he can also be called as the most sublime of English poets. There is an element of sublimity in all his works. We feel that we are being transported to a world of imagination where the poet has set the background for his works. Now, regarding the style, Milton's style, it possesses a kind of grandeur or an elevation, on account of which it is rightly called the grand style. And this grandeur or this grand style is achieved by a kind of a judicious mixture of slightly unfamiliar diction, including archaic words, metaphors, similes, allusions, etc. And we can see that there is always a beautiful blending of the sublime thought and the sublime expression in almost all his poems. So this sonnet, when I consider how my light is spent, which is popularly known as On His Blindness, is a best known sonnet written by John Milton. And it was published in Milton's 1673 poems, the collection entitled Milton 1673 Poems. And when it was given for getting it published, John Milton gave it number 19. But in the published work, it appears as number 16. So both numbers are used simultaneously, and it is popularly known under the title On His Blindness. But sadly, there is no evidence that John Milton ever used this title, that is On His Blindness. So it has been said that it was Thomas Newton, his publisher, in his 1761 edition of Milton's poetry, assigned this particular title, that is On His Blindness. So we may feel that John Milton is just mediating on the disillusionment caused by his blindness in this poem, but it is something more than that. This sonnet, it is all about the speaker's confusion on what God expects from him, as he has lost his eyesight, and he is not sure whether to continue his vocation. His vocation here is writing poetry. And as he has turned totally blind, he can no more continue his vocation, which he used for praising God. So John Milton was a poet who believed that the right way of serving God was writing in praise of him, that too through his verses, his religious verses. And now he feels that he may get punished by God for simply wasting his God-gifted talent. And he feels upset that God may even chide him for that. So this struggle, that is an internal conflict that is always there, or that is always going within the speaker, is clearly evident in the first 8 lines of the sonnet, that is the octave of the sonnet. So it is being said that it was in 1652 the poet Milton turned totally blind, that is even before writing his best works, including his magnum opus Paradise Lost. So he achieved much of his fame after becoming blind. So it was only possible because of his strong determination confidence, and optimism. So this sonnet is an autobiographical work where the poetic persona can easily be identified with the poet. The speaker is the poet himself. And regarding his blindness, it is believed that he dictated this poem to his 3 daughters, and they took down it for him and read it aloud for him for getting it corrected, and much of the drafting was done by his 3 daughters. So at first it was very difficult for him when he went totally blind. So he had to depend on others to get his works written down, read aloud for correction. But his blindness was not that crippling, and eventually he began to adapt to the new life, a life without vision. So we can see a transformation from his old self to a new one. To a new one means a regenerated self. The transformation from the old self to the one who stands and waits for his turn to come. So we get a message from this poem that if you are ready to work hard enough, life is ready to bless you with new opportunities. And Milton's poem is a telling example of the same. So now let us move on to the poem. But before that, let me explain to you what a sonnet is. So this poem is a sonnet, right? So a sonnet is a 14-lined poem, a 14-lined lyric, which in most of the cases written in iambic pentameter and with a specific rhyme scheme. Mainly there are 2 types of sonnets. First one, Italian or Petrarchan sonnet, that is named after the 14th century Italian poet Petrarch, who is very famous for his love sonnets that were dedicated to his lady love Laura. And this sonnet has 2 main divisions. There is an octave, that is the first 8 lines, rhyming ABBA, ABBA, and followed by a sestet. Sestet means 6-lined stanza. And the rhyme scheme for the sestet is CDE, CDE, or in certain cases CDC, CDC. So the rhyme scheme of the Italian or the Petrarchan type sonnet is ABBA, ABBA, CDE, CDE, and in certain cases CDC. The second type of sonnet, that is the English sonnet, which is popularly known as the Shakespearean sonnet. It was introduced into English literature by the Earl of Surrey and Thomas Wyatt, and also by certain other experimenters of the same who belonged to the 16th century, chief among whom was William Shakespeare. That is why it is known as Shakespearean sonnet. And this sonnet has a different structure when compared to the previous one. And this one has 3 quatrains. By the way, what is a quatrain? A quatrain is a 4-lined stanza. So this one has a different structure altogether. It has 3 quatrains and there is a concluding couplet. The 3 quatrains rhyming AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, and the couplet rhyming G, G. So this sonnet, that is on his blindness, it is modelled on the Petrarchan sonnet or the Italian sonnet. So now let us move on to the poem. When I consider how my light is spent. As I have told you earlier, the octave, that is the first 8 lines, it reflects the poet's confusion. We know why he is confused. He's actually frustrated over his loss of vision. And the loss of eyesight is a great misfortune for a person like John Milton, whose life plan itself was to be in service to God, which he believed he could do was only through writing poetry in praise of God. So he ponders over how all his light has been used up or spent even before completing half of his life's tenure. So a life devoid of vision means total darkness for him. It lies before him dark and wide, to use the exact phrase from the poem, dark and wide. See, the phrase dark and wide, it is very significant in the sense it is dark because he has turned blind and he cannot see. He cannot predict what is going to happen to him next in his immediate future. And also it is wide because he has gone blind at a very young age. When I consider how my light is spent, half my days in this dark world and wide. So here you might have noticed that the poet doesn't use the word vision or eyesight anywhere. Instead, he uses the word light. You know why? Because it stands a metaphor for his vision. And this metaphor is not a direct one. Instead, it is an implicit metaphor. What is an implicit metaphor? An implicit metaphor is one that implies, one that hints rather than saying things directly. So here we have an implicit metaphor, and the comparison is to an oil lamp that at once extinguishes when the oil in the lamp runs out. So that is the image that we get when we read those lines. How my light is spent, how my light has been used up. So we get an implicit image or metaphor of an oil lamp that at once got extinguished when the oil ran out. When I consider how my light is spent, half my days. So here you might have noticed the word ERE, which is spelled The word means before. It is an example of archaism. So it is an archaic word that is not in use anymore. So John Milton, he went totally blind at the age of 42. That is even before completing half of his life's tenure. That is why he has said, half my days. My light is spent totally even before completing half of my days. And hence the rest of his life is in darkness. The rest of his life, that is pretty long, lies before him dark and wide. And the very dilemma or confusion is aptly conjured up in that particular phrase, dark world and wide. So when he says dark world and wide, you can see that the verse sound is repeated, isn't it? So that is an example of alliteration. And moving on to the next line. And that one talent which is death to hide, lodged with me, useless, though my soul more bend to serve there with my Maker and present my true account. And that one talent which is death to hide, he feels that it is death to remain passive. His inaction is equal to death. So here we have a biblical allusion, precisely the parable of talents. According to the parable of talents, there was a master who gave some money to 3 of his servants just before leaving for a journey, and he asked them to use this money wisely. The first 2 servants, they used this money prudently in order to make more money out of it. But the third one, he simply buried it. And when the master returned, he was so happy with the first 2 servants who used the money wisely, and they are rewarded and they are entrusted with more responsibilities. But the third one is exiled to the realm of darkness. The master got angry with the third one for not using it prudently, for simply burying it. And he exiled this third servant to a place called darkness, which is equivalent to death. So when the poet says that it is death to hide his talent, he is actually referring to the story of this third servant. He is referring to the God-gifted talent which he is not able to use at the moment. And he feels that he is also like the third servant who cannot use his talent in a prudent way. He is also burying his talent, for he feels that he won't be able to write poetry anymore because of his blindness. So if I remain passive owing to my blindness, I'm just burying my talent just like the third servant. So it is death to hide my talent. It is equivalent to death. So writing poetry was the only vocation that he was used to, or that he was happy with, or the one that he believed that the best way to serve God. But as of now, he cannot do it. And he feels that God may punish him for not writing poetry. And also there is a hint to the political. I have already told you that John Milton, he served under Oliver Cromwell, and during that time he used his talent for writing pamphlets, several pamphlets, in order to promote the protectorate of Oliver Cromwell. So this can also be interpreted as a political reference. There is an implication to the political. So once he used his talent to promote the government, but now he cannot do that because he has totally turned blind. So he feels that his talent is lodged or buried within himself and it cannot be used anymore. And that one talent which is death to hide, lodged within me useless, though my soul more bend to serve there with my Maker and present my true account, lest he returning chide. Speaker says that though he has turned blind, his soul is still willing to serve his Maker, but he don't know what his Maker expects from him. He is not able to predict his master's plans for him, but he fears that God may chide him for not using his talent, and he fears that he may be exiled into the realm of darkness, which is much more severe and fearful than the darkness created by his own blindness, his own corporeal blindness. So he is frustrated that his lack of vision is preventing him from serving God, which he wishes to do so badly. Here the true account, to present my true account, means that is a reference to the bulk of religious poems written by John Milton. Much of his poetry can be viewed as the representations of God's relationship to mankind, and he considered it a serious duty, that is to write poetry and make God's ways more clear to people, to use his own words to justify the ways of God to man. And now when he is not able to write poetry owing to his blindness, he feels guilty. He fears that God may not excuse him. Instead, God may punish him for not using his talent. And the poet is totally helpless. He cannot compose poetry because of his blindness. But at the same time, his soul is striving or longing to serve God. That is through his religious verses. His soul is yearning to praise God through his religious poetry. So here the speaker is torn between the two extremes. One is his inability to write poetry owing to his blindness. The other extreme is his strong wish to do the same, to serve God by writing poetry. And at this point of confusion, at line 7, Milton, he asks a question. Doth God exact day labor light denied? Milton wonders if God still expects him writing poetry even without eyesight. Doth God exact day labor light denied? He doesn't know if God expects him to write poetry though light is denied, though he is blind. And now, at this juncture, his question is answered by patience. Doth God exact day labor light denied? I fondly ask, but patience, to prevent that murmur, soon replies, God doth not need either man's work or his own gifts. Who best bear his mild yoke, they serve him best. So patience, we know it is an abstract quality, but it speaks like a human being. It speaks like a friend offering consolation to the poet. And his words of consolation, it matters a lot to the ruined self of the poet. So we know patience is an abstract quality that we can only feel and we cannot see or touch. But still it speaks like a human being. So here patience is personified. The technique used by the poet is personification. Patience says that God does not need man's service. God is omnipotent. He is omniscient. He doesn't need man's service or God-gifted talents. He is perfect and complete even without man's service. So you need not worry. He can understand you because he is your maker. He is your master. He doesn't demand anything from you. He never asked you to write poetry in praise of him. And he never expects the same from you, particularly at this point. After all, your talent is nothing but the one gift given by God. So God doth not need your service, your work, your gifts. And what he expects from you, nothing but obedience. God doth not need either man's work or his own gifts. Who best bear his mild yoke, they serve him best. So Patience says that those individuals who are most submissive and docile to God's determination are always the best. So what God expects from you is nothing but obedience. You just stay loyal to him. You just let him lead you. That is all what is expected of you. So those individuals who remain loyal and obedient to God are always the best. And those who consents God to control them and to allow their fate to be written or shaped by God are the best servants of God, as if they were wearing a yoke. You can see the use of the word yoke, wearing a mild yoke. A yoke is actually a wooden frame that is fastened around the necks of domesticated animals like ox, cow, so that they can be directed, so that they can be led in the right way. So just like those domesticated animals who wear a yoke around their neck, we human beings also have that yoke around our neck. That is nothing but our will, our free will. So if we allow God to lead us properly, in a proper way, he shall be happy with us. And you can see that God's yoke is presented as something that is mild. And we get an idea that God never imposes this yoke or this will upon human beings. He is not a cruel dictator nor a cruel slave master. His plans are not severe. Instead, they are mild. So those who obeys him are always the best. So you need not worry. So you need not write poetry in praise of God. It cannot satisfy him unless you are an obedient servant. He doesn't demand any material things from human beings, and all what he looks forward to is obedience and nothing else. Because he is perfect, because God is complete, and his state is kingly. Thousands at his bidding speed, and post over land and ocean without rest. They also serve who only stand and wait. See, God is the supreme Lord, by whose command or will thousands are ready to do selfless service. So with his kingly status, God has plenty of people to do his bidding, that too by rushing from one place to other without rest. So it doesn't make a difference if one more person does this job or not. So if you don't write poetry anymore, it is not going to make a difference. But it doesn't mean that if one remains idle, God will be happy or pleased with them. Here God is ready to excuse the poet because he is blind. He can understand because God is the maker. So at this point, it doesn't make any difference if the poet writes poetry in praise of God or not, because he is the supreme Lord, and there are thousands and thousands ready to do the same for him. Here thousands and thousands are also a reference to angels who are ready to serve him. So kings also have plenty who wait on him, who stand in a state of readiness until their turn comes. They also serve who only stand and wait. So Patience consoles him by saying that even his act of staying with Patience or his inaction that resulted from his blindness is estimated as a kind of service, a sort of service. Because God, whose status is kingly, also have people who wait on him, who stand patiently in a state of readiness until their turn comes. So you are also like that one. You also stand patiently for your turn to come. So that is also a sort of service. So God doesn't need anything from human beings, for all human possessions are God's gifts. And now the poet is relieved and he finds solace in the words of Patience. Actually, Patience is nothing but a representation of the poet's own ruined self. It is the poet's self that appears in the guise of Patience in order to offer consolation to the ruined or agonized soul of the poet who is in a state of dilemma. So we get a message that if we are ready to do hard work life is ready to help us with new opportunities. And John Milton's life itself seems to be a telling example of the same. The poet is also trying to hint at the futility of human practices of writing in praise of God, performing rituals and offerings just for the sake of pleasing God. So what is the use of all those rituals and practices? They are totally meaningless. These are not the things that God, your maker, expects from you. All what he expects from you is obedience, or the just use of your free will. The greatest gift God has bestowed upon human beings is the choice of free will. And it is up to you whether to use it in a right way or in a wrong way. And if you are using it in a proper way or in the right way, God is ready to help you. Life is ever ready to help you to achieve greatness in life. So God's plans are not severe. He is not a cruel dictator. He is the Supreme Lord. He doesn't need anything back from human. All what he expects from all of us is obedience and nothing else. So we can also see that the poet is actually justifying his passivity. Actually, it is not his fault. It happened to him so. The poet was not able to write poetry, at least for a short period of his life, only due to his blindness. And even after that, he wrote a number of works. So he cannot be considered as a person who whiled away his time or simply wasted away his talent. He is a right servant to God. So the message that we get from this poem is that never get disillusioned with instant failures. You have to try and try until you achieve your goal. And if you are determined, everything around you shall be ready to help you in different ways in achieving your goal. So never get disappointed or disillusioned with the failures that befall us. Now regarding the major themes, we have a number of themes in this poem. Major themes are vision or eyesight. So Milton's loss of sight, it is a major theme of this poem, isn't it? And we can see that his loss of eyesight was actually something that was anticipated. It was an anticipated disaster because this defect was already there in his family and his mother had a terrible eyesight. So the poet's blindness and the confusion, the disillusionment that stems out of it forms a major theme of this poem. Other themes being obedience, guilt. The poet feels guilty for not using his talent properly, and he fears that he may be exiled to the kingdom of darkness, just like the third servant in the parable of talents. Then religion is yet another important theme. His use of this parable of talents is an example of his encyclopedic knowledge of the Bible. And we know John Milton was a Puritan. A Puritan means an extreme Protestant. So his religion was, to be precise, Puritanism. And regarding the figures of speech used, the literary devices used, we have metaphor. In the first line itself, we have a metaphor, that is an implicit metaphor. Light, it stands a metaphor for the poet's vision or eyesight. At the same time, it is a symbol also. Then we have archaism or archaic word, the second line, that is meaning before. Then we have the phrase dark world and wide. That is an example of a metaphorical phrase. It stands a metaphor of his blindness or lack of vision. Then we have alliteration. In the same phrase, dark world and wide, the word sound is repeated. Then there is use of allusion. We have biblical allusion. That is the reference. What is an allusion? Allusion is a passing reference. So here the poet alludes to the parable of talents. Then there is personification. You can see that patience is personified. Then we have one more example of metaphor, that is yoke, the mild yoke. The yoke is a metaphor of obedience, and it is a symbol of the free will too. It is at the same time a metaphor and also a powerful symbol. Then we have the use of enjambment. What is enjambment? Enjambment means run-on lines. The idea is carried on to the next line without a pause or a punctuation. We can see examples of enjambment in the third line, the fourth line, the fifth line, 8th line, 9th line, 11th, 12 and 13. So they are just run-on lines. At the end there won't be any punctuation marks or pause. Then regarding the form, it is modeled on a typical Italian sonnet with a rhyme scheme of ABBA, ABBA, CDE, CDE. And the meter here is iambic pentameter, that is with 5 iambs and an accented syllable followed by an accented. So that is all about the sonnet on his blindness. So thank you for listening and watching.